Well, for more on what Boeing's new CEO is taking on, let's bring in Seth Kaplan. He's a transportation analyst for NPR. Welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure, Rochelle.
So let's start with a look at Calhoun's history with Boeing and how he might be different from his predecessor.
Well, this is somebody who did not have a long career at Boeing. Certainly a lot of familiarity with the aerospace industry. GE, overseeing the part of that company that makes the engines for many of Boeing's planes and so forth. So no stranger to this company, most recently chairman of its board, but somebody who's also had experience outside of Boeing, and perhaps can marry his knowledge of the company with his knowledge of other healthy organizations and hopefully bring Boeing through and beyond this crisis, because let's be very clear, this is indeed a crisis for his company, most serious it's ever faced.
And he does have quite a bit of experience when it comes to crisis management, something that you figure will serve him well here. Now, there are a number of issues to tackle, from the financial to the public relations angles. What do you think are Calhoun's most immediate priority?
Well, I think you hit it there, to public relations, and we can divide that broadly to include relations with his regulator, the FAA, and its counterparts around the world, with politicians. And I think that was really the downfall there of Dennis Muhlenberg. Everything that happened before the crash is well documented, and he wasn't fired for that. It was the management after that. And once the FAA, which had been accused of being too cozy with Boeing, had lost its patience, I think at that point he had to move on. So then the flip side of that, Calhoun's most important job, other than obviously the safe reintroduction of the plane itself, but that's what the engineers are for, his job is to restore confidence in the company on the part of the regulator, politicians, and the flying public.
So then, how is Calhoun being received by the Boeing workforce in this new position?
It seems like everybody is hopeful of turning the page here. This has been a tumultuous time. Imagine being inside that organization and having to show up every day and do your job with what's being written about the company. I can't imagine it, and I've spoken with people there, and yeah, most of them, look, they're not at that level, and they're not at that pay grade where they're used to being under the kind of scrutiny that the leaders are, and so they're looking for leadership. And look, companies have done it before. Companies in crisis have managed to turn themselves around. Others haven't. Boeing has certain advantages when you kind of try to draw parallels with past crises. I mean, it's fortunate to be half of a powerful manufacturing duopoly. That's important here. Aren't too many places to buy these airplanes, right, but it can't take any of its business for granted. It has a real problem on its hands. And
a lot of people were wondering about employee morale, especially when we saw some of the leaked comments from their internal memos talking about the relationship and sort of the missed signs when it comes to the 737 MAX. How does one regain the public's trust now that everyone's really hyper-aware about this model?
Well, that's, again, when you sort of try to draw from history, right, parallels to other past crises. It's getting harder to do because there's so little precedent for something like this, for something that just drags on so long. The public tends to move past crises when we look either within the airline industry or just at other examples in the world. But typically, something doesn't stay in the headlines as long as this has. You and I have talked in the past about this. I think in the end, there's not much Boeing can say. This is one of those, to use the very overused cliche that actions speak louder than words. I mean, that's never been truer than it is here. This plane's just going to have to get up, flying safely for a period of time before people are going to feel like, well, you know what, this does indeed seem to be fixed. And at a certain point, people will get back to making their decisions based on the reason they usually choose flights, price, schedule, maybe the product of an airline rather than what kind of aircraft they're flying. But it'll be interesting to see. I thought for a while that, there might be a handful of people who wouldn't take those first flights. Right. I'm not so sure that it's just going to be a few people, even if indeed in the long run people do move on.
And we talked a little bit about the coziness between Boeing and regulators. Do you think this added scrutiny now will sort of fundamentally change that relationship?
I do. I think that there's a system that's in place that in some ways this is, to use another cliche, a very big boat that's hard to turn on a dime, right? So these questions about sort of the self-certification, Boeing's role and all of that, I don't think that the system as it exists is about to get completely ripped up and rebuilt from scratch, because I think that's hard to do. But there are going to be some very fundamental changes where the FAA is not simply going to sign off on what it's being told. That's the difference. I think there will be coordination for the long run because just the reality is that some of the best engineers are at the company. And so the FAA has to work closely with them. But the distinction now is, when closely sort of spilled over into something perhaps far worse that enabled this to happen, I think that's what has to stop it and what I think will stop. There's just too much scrutiny for it not to.
All right, always good to see you. Seth Kaplan there, transportation analyst at NPR.